The night was shrouded in a thick fog as heavy rain pelted down on the winding mountain road. Visibility was poor, and the darkness seemed to swallow every sound. Amidst this eerie atmosphere, an old bus sped along, cutting through the silence. The bus was packed with passengers, most of whom were weary and half asleep, their heads leaning against the misty windows. Among the few who were still awake was a young man named Jack. Jack sat by the window, staring out into the darkness with vacant eyes. His face was gaunt, his eyes red from exhaustion, showing signs of sleepless nights. Something weighed heavily on his mind, a dark memory that clung to him like a shadow. Although his body was in the bus, his thoughts drifted far away, ensnared in a whirlpool of guilt and regret. As the bus approached a sharp curve overlooking a deep ravine, Jack felt an intense unease, a gut feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Up in the driver's seat, an older man with deep wrinkles struggled to stay awake. His eyelids drooped, briefly closing before he jolted himself awake. The rain lashed violently against the windshield, blurring his already limited vision. The road was slick, and the dim streetlights barely pierced through the thick fog. Despite the hazardous conditions, the driver pushed forward, perhaps pressured by the passengers' impatience or driven by the desire to finish the trip as quickly as possible. Tension reached its peak as the bus finally arrived at the sharp curve leading directly to the ravine. With the road as slippery as it was and the driver already fatigued, disaster was inevitable. The bus skidded uncontrollably, and in those few heart-stopping seconds, chaos erupted. Some passengers awoke in sheer panic, screams and desperate prayers mingling with the screeching of metal and the shattering of glass. Time seemed to slow down in the final moments before the bus plummeted into the darkness. Jack's eyes locked onto the approaching abyss, yet there was no fear in his heart, only a deep, overwhelming sense of regret for the life he could never amend. When the bus finally crashed into the depths below, silence fell, broken only by the echo of the impact. The crash claimed almost all the passengers, including Jack. But death wasn't the end of his story, it was just the beginning of a new horror. In the days that followed, rumors spread about the site of the accident. People reported sightings of a young man standing by the edge of the cliff, drenched as if he had just climbed out of the abyss. His vacant stare was said to be filled with longing and despair. Locals began to call this restless spirit the cliff's watcher, always waiting for something, or someone. The tale of the cliff's watcher grew more frequent. The locals spoke of him with hushed tones, warning travelers not to pass through the area at night, especially when fog settled in and rain began to pour. Those who dared to drive down that road after dark often claimed to see a shadowy figure by the cliff's edge, standing still, as if in endless anticipation. But the most terrifying stories came from drivers who claimed to have seen the figure waving for a ride, only to disappear as they approached. One such driver was Mark, a rideshare driver who experienced the terror firsthand. One night, he received a request to pick up a passenger near the cliff, close to the site of the bus crash. Despite a gnawing feeling of unease, Mark accepted the ride since it wasn't too far away. When he arrived at the pickup point, he saw a young man standing alone by the roadside, soaked through in an old, tattered jacket. The man's head was bowed, his face obscured by wet hair. "Take me to the cliff, please." The young man's voice was low and devoid of emotion, as if drained of all life. Mark nodded, though a chill ran down his spine. The ride was eerily silent, the only sound being the relentless pounding of rain on the roof and road. Mark glanced at the rearview mirror several times, trying to get a better look at his passenger, but each time he looked, the figure seemed to blur, as if he was not entirely there. When they finally reached the destination, the exact spot where the bus had plunged into the ravine, the young man spoke again. "Thank you, this is where I get off," he said in a cold, distant tone. Mark pulled over and turned around to ask for payment, but to his horror, the back seat was empty. The only trace left behind was a wet seat and a few droplets of water. Terrified, Mark sped away without looking back, vowing never to accept a ride request from that area again. Mark's story quickly spread, fueling the fear surrounding the cursed road. But amidst the fear, there was also curiosity, which caught the attention of a well-known paranormal investigator named Mr. Shaw. He believed that every restless spirit was tied to this world by unresolved trauma, guilt, or unfinished business. Determined to find answers, Mr. Shaw began researching the history of the bus crash and the identity of the mysterious young man. Mr. Shaw's investigation led him to the discovery of Jack's troubled past. According to what he uncovered, Jack had been plagued with guilt over the tragic death of his younger brother in a car accident years before. That incident had left Jack broken, spiraling into depression and despair. On the day of the bus crash, Jack was reportedly distant and disturbed, as if weighed down by something unbearable. Mr. Shaw decided to conduct a séance at the crash site, hoping to communicate with Jack's spirit and help him find peace. On a cold, foggy night, he and his assistant made their way to the Cursed Cliff, as it was now infamously known. They set up a salt circle near the edge, lit candles, and began chanting incantations to summon the spirit. As the ritual commenced, the once still air suddenly grew violent. A strong wind began whipping around them, causing the candle flames to flicker erratically. A thick fog enveloped the area, blurring the line between reality and the supernatural. The temperature dropped sharply, and a faint creaking sound echoed from deep within the ravine. Mr. Shaw could feel a presence, yet it was hesitant, as if it were caught between worlds. Minutes passed before a shadowy figure emerged from the mist. Though his features were indistinct, the energy radiating from the figure told Mr. Shaw that this was indeed Jack. "What keeps you bound to this place?" Mr. Shaw asked firmly, hoping to break through the spirit's sorrow. Jack's ghost stared back, his empty gaze penetrating through Mr. Shaw, sending shivers down his spine. Slowly, the ghost began to speak, his voice low and heavy with anguish. "I'm trapped, here, by my guilt. I let my brother die, and then I chose to die here. But there's something far darker, lurking here." Mr. Shaw was taken aback by Jack's words. He tried to delve deeper, but before Jack could reveal more, a faint, sinister laugh echoed from behind him. Startled, Mr. Shaw spun around, but there was nothing there. When he turned back, Jack's ghost had begun to dissolve into the mist, slipping away into the shadows. The oppressive atmosphere hinted that something much more malevolent was hidden beneath the surface. The ritual left Mr. Shaw with more questions than answers. He sensed that there was a powerful dark force at play, one that was far older and more dangerous than a mere restless spirit. His research led him to a chilling revelation: the cliff had a history of mysterious accidents long before the bus crash. It seemed that something evil had claimed this place as its domain, preying on the sorrow and despair of lost souls like Jack. A violent gust of wind surged through the area, bringing with it a fog so thick it swallowed everything in its path. Disoriented, Mr. Shaw tried to maintain his focus, but the oppressive laughter of the entity echoed from all directions. Desperation clawed at his mind as he realized they were up against something far beyond what they had prepared for. Stumbling in the thick fog, Mr. Shaw tried to find Mrs. Reed, but all he could see was swirling mist. Suddenly, the fog cleared just enough for him to see a figure standing at the cliff's edge, Jack's ghost, smiling eerily. But this time, Mr. Shaw noticed something off. The way Jack stood, the emptiness in his eyes, it wasn't a plea for help, it was triumph. In a horrifying moment of clarity, Mr. Shaw realized the truth: Jack was never a victim. The entity had been Jack all along, manipulating events to trap more souls and feed off their despair. Jack's tragic backstory and guilt were carefully crafted lies, designed to invoke sympathy and lure the curious. The real Jack had never been tormented, he had become the very darkness that haunted the cliff. The entity had merged with Jack's spirit, and together they had become something monstrous, thriving on the endless cycle of pain and fear. As Mr. Shaw comprehended the twisted truth, the figure of Jack began to shift, morphing into a grotesque blend of the young man and the shadowy creature that had terrorized them earlier. With a malevolent grin, the entity whispered, "You've come exactly where I wanted you. Now, you'll never leave." Before Mr. Shaw could react, the ground beneath him crumbled, and he felt himself falling into the abyss. As he plummeted into the darkness, the last thing he heard was the twisted, mocking laughter of the entity that had now claimed him as its latest victim. Back at the cliff, the fog cleared, leaving only an eerie silence. The cliff's watcher was back in his place, waiting for the next curious soul to approach, perpetuating the endless cycle of terror. The twist reveals that what seemed like a restless spirit seeking peace was actually a trap designed by an ancient evil, merging with Jack's soul to create an entity that uses deception to continue its reign of terror.